The rain poured heavily against the glowing city skyline, drenching the streets in a shimmering layer of gold and silver. The night was alive with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional honk of a car passing by. Inside a luxurious 5-star hotel, the lobby gleamed with polished marble floors, massive chandeliers, and staff moving with quiet efficiency. It was the kind of place where the rich and powerful retreated after a long day, their world so far removed from ordinary life that stepping inside felt like entering a different universe altogether. Emma had no idea she was about to step into one of those worlds. She was exhausted. Her phone was dead. Her feet ached from walking in heels that were never meant for this much movement. And her mind was a blur of frustration and confusion. The charity gala she had been invited to had ended in disaster. She had lost her purse, which meant no money, no ID, and no way to get home. And worst of all, she had somehow misplaced the room key card her friend had given her for the night. She sighed, rubbing her temples as she stared at the rows of elevator buttons. She remembered her friend's message. Room 1805. Just go up and rest. You'll be fine. With that in mind, she pressed the button and leaned against the elevator wall, watching as the numbers slowly climbed. When the doors slid open, she stepped out, following the long, dimly lit hallway, counting the numbers until she reached the right one. Or at least, what she thought was the right one. She pushed the door open, grateful that it wasn't locked. The moment she stepped inside, warmth wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. The room smelled expensive, fresh linens, faint cologne, and a lingering scent of sandalwood. She barely took in the high ceilings, the enormous windows overlooking the city, or the plush, king-sized bed. All she could think about was sleep. Kicking off her shoes, she barely managed to pull off her coat before collapsing onto the soft mattress. Her tired body melted into the silky sheets, and before she could think twice about it, her eyes fluttered shut. What she didn't know was that the bed wasn't empty. Several minutes later, the sound of the shower turning off echoed through the suite. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the bathroom, his wet hair tousled, a towel wrapped loosely around his waist. He rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling as he walked toward the bed. It had been an exhausting day. Meetings, deals, endless negotiations. All he wanted was to crash into bed and forget about the world for a few hours. But the moment he pulled back the covers, he froze. Someone was in his bed. His sharp blue eyes narrowed as he took in the sight before him. Long wavy brown hair spread across the pillow, soft lips slightly parted in deep sleep, and delicate fingers gripping the edge of the blanket as if she belonged there. His jaw tightened. Who the hell was this woman? His first instinct was to wake her up immediately, demand an explanation, call security if needed. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the peaceful way she slept, or the fact that she didn't look like someone who had broken in with bad intentions. There was no sign of deceit, no sign of malice. She looked lost. Still, this was his suite, his private space, and no one entered his world without his permission. Taking a deep breath, he reached out, gently shaking her shoulder. "Hey!" His voice came out firm, deep, authoritative. "Who are you?" Emma stirred slightly, groaning in her sleep, turning to the other side. She mumbled something incoherent, clearly still half dreaming. His patience thinned. He shook her again, this time firmer. "Wake up!" Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she stared at him, her sleepy mind struggling to register what was happening. Then, as her gaze traveled from his face to his bare chest to the expensive suite around her, a realization hit. Her heart stopped. This wasn't her room. And the man standing over her wasn't just any man. It was Alexander Knight, the billionaire, the same Alexander Knight whose face was on magazine covers, whose name was whispered in business circles with admiration and fear, the same man who had entire corporations at his feet and women practically throwing themselves at him. And she had just spent the night in his bed, her breath hitched, panic shooting through her veins. I think there's been a mistake, she stammered, scrambling to sit up, clutching the blanket to her chest, as if it could somehow shield her from the reality of what had just happened. Alexander folded his arms, watching her with a mixture of amusement and suspicion. I'd say, so. His voice was smooth, controlled, yet dangerously unreadable. Care to explain why you're in my bed? Emma's mind raced. How had this happened? How had she made such a ridiculous mistake? She had been so sure this was the right room, but clearly it wasn't. I must have entered the wrong room, she said quickly, her face heating up. I swear I didn't mean to. My friend gave me a room key, but I must have. She cut herself off, realizing how insane she sounded. Alexander arched a brow. You expect me to believe that you just accidentally walked into my penthouse and fell asleep? Yes, she blurted out, her pulse hammering. I was tired. I didn't check properly. And I didn't even know this was a penthouse. I thought it was just a regular room. For a long moment, he simply studied her. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. Curiosity, suspicion, maybe even amusement. Then, much to her horror, he smirked. Well, he said slowly, his voice like velvet. This is a first. Emma swallowed hard, unsure whether she wanted to laugh, cry, or run out of there as fast as possible. But before she could decide, there was a sudden knock on the door. Mr. Knight, a voice called from outside. Your morning meeting is about to begin. Her stomach dropped. Alexander let out a quiet sigh, rubbing his temple. Perfect timing, he muttered, before turning back to her. Looks like we don't have time. For a long explanation, Emma stared at him, her heart pounding. So, what now? A slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. Well, sweetheart, he said, leaning against the door frame. You just woke up in a billionaire's bed. I'd say, you better prepare for the consequences. Her breath caught. She had no idea what that meant, but something told her. Her life was about to change forever. Emma's heart pounded as Alexander's words echoed in her head. You better prepare for the consequences. She swallowed hard, gripping the blanket around her like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. This had to be a nightmare, some bizarre, ridiculous dream that she would wake up from any second now. But the intensity in Alexander's gaze told her otherwise. Before she could say another word, the knocking at the door continued. Mr. Knight, the voice repeated, this time more urgent. Your meeting is scheduled to start in 10 minutes. Alexander exhaled, clearly annoyed, but his attention remained fixed on her. We'll continue this conversation later, he said smoothly, as if he were in complete control of the situation. Emma barely managed a nod, her mind still spinning. She needed to get out of there, fast. But just as she tried to slip off the bed, she realized something horrifying. Her dress. She was still in the same formal gown from last night, but it was completely wrinkled from sleep, and her hair was a mess. If anyone saw her leaving Alexander Knight's penthouse in this state, there would be no explaining it. Panic surged through her. I can't just walk out like this, she whispered, her voice barely steady. Alexander studied her for a moment before walking over to his massive wardrobe. Without saying a word, he pulled out a crisp, white dress shirt and tossed it to her. "Put this on," he said simply. She hesitated, but knew she had no choice. With her heart still hammering, she grabbed the shirt and quickly slipped it over her dress, the fabric swallowing her frame. It smelled like expensive cologne and something uniquely him. But she ignored that. Focusing only on survival, Alexander smirked slightly as he watched her struggle to roll up the sleeves. "Not exactly your size, but it'll do," he mused. "Now, follow me." Before she could argue, he was already walking toward a hidden side door, away from the main entrance. Emma hurried after him, her bare feet moving swiftly across the cool floor. He led her through a quiet hallway that connected to a private elevator. "This will take you to the lobby," he said, pressing a button. "No one will see you." Emma blinked up at him, unsure whether to thank him or yell at him for putting her in this situation in the first place. Instead, she just swallowed and nodded. "Thank you." Alexander tilted his head slightly, his smirk never fading. "Try not to break into any more billionaire suites, sweetheart." Before she could reply, the elevator doors slid shut, cutting her off from him entirely. Emma exhaled heavily, pressing her back against the elevator wall. Her life had officially turned into a mess. As soon as she stepped into the hotel lobby, she kept her head down and rushed outside, ignoring the curious glances from the staff. The fresh morning air hit her face, but it did nothing to clear the chaos in her mind. She needed to get home. She needed to forget this ever happened, but fate had other plans. Emma gripped the phone tighter, her breath shallow. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, at least not like this, but there he was. His voice smooth and unreadable on the other end of the line. "We need to talk," Alexander repeated, his tone firm but not unkind. Emma's mind raced. She could refuse, pretend none of this had ever happened. But deep down, she knew she couldn't run from this. Not when the entire city was buzzing with rumors. Not when her face was all over the internet. "Okay," she said finally, barely, recognizing her own voice. "Where?" "Come to my office." A pause. "Now." Before she could even process the weight of that command, the line went dead. Emma exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. She had no idea what awaited her, but there was no turning back now.